The history of the Indiana State Fair is made of millions of scenes, fascinating, incredible, and shocking scenes. Witnessed in exhibit halls, from the stands of the Coliseum, and in the cloth tents of the sideshows. Scenes of friends and families enjoying a day of leisure, of farmers learning about the most recent innovations, of couples winning giant stuffed animals, and of kids trying cotton candy for the very first time. So, in this episode of Talking Hoosier History, we bring you just a few of those scenes that, when put together, will give you a glimpse into the rich and vibrant history of the Indiana State Fair. Hello, and welcome to Talking Hoosier History, brought to you by the Indiana Historical Bureau. For over a century, we've been marking Hoosier history. Now it's time to start Talking Hoosier History. I'm Lindsay Beckley, and I'll be your guide through the Indiana State Fair. Scene 1, the first fair. In 1850, nearly 60% of all men in Indiana were farmers. 12,793,422 acres of fertile farmland stretched across the Hoosier State. It's no surprise then that Indiana Governor Joseph Wright was concerned with the advancement of agriculture in his state. In order to encourage steady progress, Governor Wright urged the Indiana General Assembly to pass an act establishing the State Board of Agriculture, whose mission was to move Indiana to the forefront of farm production. One way in which the board fostered development was by establishing a place for farmers to share new ideas and theories, as well as exhibit the products of their hard work. To facilitate such a gathering, the first Indiana State Fair was held in 1852 in what's today Military Park in Indianapolis. From October 20th to October 22nd, over 1,000 farmers gathered to display over 1,300 exhibit entries. Cash premiums were awarded in such categories as Best 3-Year-Old Bull, Best Stallion for Heavy Draft, Best Manure Fork, and Best Lot of Butter made from 5 cows in 30 consecutive days. Unfortunately, no award was given that year for Best Pair Men's Cowhide Shoes. The fair was a rousing success. Attendance was estimated at 30,000 people, an impressive number considering that this was well before automobiles and paved roads made travel fast and convenient. One Monroe County farmer wrote about the fair.
It reflects honor upon all and must make every Indianan more proud of his state. For its inventive genius and skill, its preserving industry and energy, no one doubts that important results will flow from this exhibition.
There are thin ones, there are fat ones, they're all inside.
Scene 2, Curiosities, Rarities, Oddities. In 1870, all non-educational attractions were banned from the Indiana State Fair. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the early years of the fair, board members struggled to strike a balance between educational exhibits that would advance the state's agricultural progress and attractions that would draw in enough people to offset the fair costs. Whether the board liked it or not, sideshows were among the most popular attractions for the average Hoosier. At the first fair, there were reports of grizzly bears, a learned pig, and trained seals on display. But it wasn't always just strange or exotic animals that were showcased in these traveling sideshows. Sometimes the recipients of the pointing fingers and the wide eyes were entirely human. This era of showbiz history was unfortunately called the freak show era, after the so-called freaks who were often billed as their main attraction.
A sample of the marvelous freaks you'll see for the price of a small thin dime.
In reality, those so-called freaks were just regular people with visible differences from the average person. Some were discriminated against because of the way they were born. They were called, quote, born different people. Some were gawked at due to a strange skill or physical feat they could perform. Showrunners said those people were, quote, made freaks. Some were simply very tall, very short, obese, or from a different land. Promoters labeled them as curiosities, rarities, oddities, wonders, mistakes, prodigies, special people, and sometimes even monsters. Sometimes these people had chosen to join the show, but more often they were driven to do so out of desperation after being turned away from society, or even sold into the show as children. Knowing this, it's not too surprising that sideshows were such a controversial topic. What may be surprising, though, is why they were controversial. Victorian morality is often cited as the root of the contention, but not in the way that I had assumed before doing my research. Oftentimes, it was the people thronging in to see the sideshows that moral authorities were concerned with, rather than the performers themselves. For example, in his argument for the 1870 ban on sideshows, Fair Board Superintendent John Sullivan did not express concern about the human beings in the shows being treated as no more than objects of curiosity. Rather, he was concerned that the shows would detract from the educational aspects of the fair, asking,
Does the young lad remember more of Fine Art Hall than of the Snake Show? Are the impressions formed in the first as lasting as in the second?
He also expressed disgust towards the type of people who would be attending such a show, saying,
They bring in their trail the worst classes of thieves and scoundrels of low and high degree.
Similarly, in 1901, the State Board of Agriculture endeavored to
make this fair of such a character as would appeal to the best element of society, a fair where the most refined and Christian lady could take her children and enjoy a day in viewing the wonderful progress displayed.
And so the fairgrounds and the surrounding area were cleared of, quote, anything that would offend refined tastes, and that included the sideshows. Time and again, the prohibition of sideshows at the fair came with admonishments about the moral influence of the people in the shows, instead of moral outrage at the treatment of those people. It would be decades before the sideshows closed for good. Some sources link the rising consciousness of equality for people with disabilities and the establishment of the Americans with Disabilities Act with the close of this dark chapter of the Indiana State Fair.
On behalf of all of the State Fair Board and all the good guys from WIFB, may I present the Beatles!
Scene 3. Hush, those Beatles are in Indiana. If you run a search of digitized Indiana newspapers from 1960 to 1963 for the term the Beatles, you get a little over 50 results. Running that same search for 1964 brings up over 4,500 results. It's safe to say that Indiana, along with the rest of America, caught Beatlemania in 1964 when the pop group launched their first American tour. The mania reached a crescendo in Indiana when, on September 3rd, the Fab Four came to the Indiana State Fair. The news was announced on April 8th and was accompanied by headlines like,
Singing Beatles will appear at Indiana State Fair.
and
Hoosiers and the Beatles.
and lots of yeahs. Tickets to the two shows, one in the Indiana State Fair Coliseum and one in front of the grandstand, were sold out even before they were printed, leading one teenager to write to an Indiana congressman pleading for help in obtaining a ticket. She wrote, "If I cannot see the Beatles, I'll surely wither away." Preparations for the band were extensive. After seeing the group mobbed by crazed fans in other cities, security was made a top priority. A security force of over 150 police officers and state troopers were assigned to guard the Beatles and the stage. After hearing of young girls fainting and collapsing during other concerts, plans for the medical care of fans were formed, including strategically placed stretchers and ambulances, as well as the presence of medical personnel. Finally, All that was left to do was welcome those English invaders and the hysteria that seemed to accompany them wherever they went. Arriving early on September 3rd, the group was whisked away to the Speedway Motel in Indianapolis by their security escort. A small group of fans had gathered at the motel, but they were mostly well-behaved except for one young man who, impersonating a hotel waiter, snuck into what he thought was the Beatles room, only to find it empty. Fans began arriving early for the Coliseum show. The crowd surged with excitement each time someone thought they had glimpsed one of the band members. After tolerating several opening acts, it was the moment all those starstruck teenagers had been waiting for.
May I present the Beatles!
The band took the stage and opened with Twist and Shout.
Hello?
The screaming was so loud that it all but drowned out the music. As girls were overcome by their excitement and fainted, Red Cross workers wound their way through the crowd to administer treatment. All told, 35 fans were treated at the Fairgrounds Red Cross Hospital that day, all with Beatle-related ailments. After the 5 o'clock show, the English rockers were taken to the fair's communication center for one of their famously droll press interviews, which featured some real zingers, such as when, in response to the question, "How do you stand on the Vietnam draft?" John Lennon said, "About 5 foot 11 inches." Once the interview was complete, they had the pleasure of meeting the Indiana State Fair Queen, Cheryl Lee Garrett, who later said that while she had enjoyed meeting the Beatles, she had been more impressed with country music singer Tennessee Ernie Ford. The second show went smoothly, and it was late when the quartet made it back to the Speedway Motel with their police escort. In the wee hours of the morning, some of the state troopers found Ringo Starr sitting poolside. The troopers asked if Starr would like to go for a ride, and Starr accompanied them on a tour of the city. With dawn fast approaching, the group decided to stop at one of the troopers' homes for breakfast, but found that there was no food to be had. Instead, they had coffee while the troopers' children snuck furtive peeks at the English rocker. The cup Starr drank from that morning sat in the family home for years to come, one of the many keepsakes fans across the state treasured to remind them of the only time the Beatles ever made it to the Hoosier State. Scene 4. Caroline Jessop, the Lady Confectioner. Caroline Jessop started her business by hauling candy-making equipment from county fair to county fair in a trunk on a horse-drawn carriage. It being a simple enterprise, not necessarily legally recorded, it's not surprising that pinning down an exact start date for the Lady Confectioner's stand is a difficult task. Reports of the date of its creation vary wildly, from as early as 1850 to as late as the 1870s. Considering Caroline Jessop was all of 11 years old in 1850, I think we can guess that she started a bit later. What is certain is that by the early 20th century, Caroline Jessop had made a name for herself as one of the best candy makers in the Midwest, and Jessop's candy became a staple of the Indiana State Fair. A magazine published by the Indiana State Fair Board called Hub of the Universe wrote that Jessop's candy was, quote, always known for its purity, her tent for its cleanliness. Jessop's most famous creation, butterscotch popcorn, was made from a recipe so secret, so safe, that it was eventually lost to time. Although the sweet treat is still made using a recipe as close to the original as possible. Caroline Jessop and her family branched out from the confectioner's business to other fair-related industries. After her death in 1916, her will distributed her, quote, Fairgrounds outfit and confectionery outfit to her 3 sons, Edward, Charles, and Joseph Jessop, and her, quote, share of a Ferris wheel to her son, Edward Jessop, to be used or disposed of as he wishes. As the family tree grew, they took on different fair routes, making the Jessop name nationally known. One 5th-generation Jessop claimed that he had handed butterscotch corn to the likes of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and President Harry S. Truman. At some points in the history of the Indiana State Fair, the Jessops had as many as 7 stands scattered across the fairgrounds. In recent years, ever more bizarre food can be found at the State Fair, but right there alongside the deep-fried peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and the deep-fried barbecue bacon are the same Jessop classics: butterscotch corn, saltwater taffy, and candy apples. All treats that the family has been selling to Hoosier fairgoers for generations. Speaking of Hoosier women hard at work, just like Caroline Jessop in that last scene, we're excited to announce a call for papers for the 3rd annual Hoosier Women at Work Conference. The symposium will focus on the history of Indiana women in the arts and will be held at the Harrison Center for the Arts in downtown Indianapolis on April 6, 2018. We hope you'll submit your paper or panel idea by December 1, 2017, and help us expand the knowledge of Hoosier women's work in the arts. Go to www.in.gov/history/Hoosier Women at Work to find out more, or call the Indiana Historical Bureau at 317-232-2536. Now, back to the fair. Scene 5, Hook's Dependable Drugstore. For over half a century, history-loving fairgoers have had the opportunity to walk through the doors of the Hook's Historic Drugstore Museum and be transported to a 19th century pharmacy and soda fountain. For all the times I've visited the building, located just inside Gate 1 of the fairgrounds, I've never stopped to wonder why it was there until now. As a lover of history and of the Indiana State Fair, it only made sense for me to look into the only official museum on the fairgrounds while researching this episode dedicated to the Indiana State Fair. While some of our younger listeners might not have heard of Hook's Drugstore, older Hoosiers have memories of visiting their local Hooks, not only for their medicinal needs, but also for candy, comics, soda, and more. John Hook opened his first apothecary in 1900 on the southeast side of Indianapolis. 8 years later, he partnered with Edward Roche to open a second store, also in Indianapolis. The chain expanded to include 53 stores by Hook's death in 1943. Hook's returned to the hands of the family when Bud Hook took over as president after the death of his father's business partner in 1956. It was under Bud that the chain expanded into one of the largest regional drugstores in America. The 1966 State Fair saw the opening of the Hook's Historical Drugstore and Pharmacy Museum, originally planned as a temporary exhibit contributing to the fair's celebration of Indiana's sesquicentennial of statehood. Located in what was once the Better Babies building, the walls of the recreated apothecary were lined with mid-19th century pharmacy cabinets, and the museum filled with antique drugstore artifacts. At the time of its opening, newspapers reported that it was, quote, the nation's most complete and elaborate restoration of a 19th century drugstore. Highlights of the original store and museum included a collection of early patent medicines, advertising signs, and surgical and dental instruments. With visitation estimated at 130,000 visitors, the exhibit, which also functioned as a small drugstore, was wildly popular during the 1966 State Fair. So popular that Bud Hook, along with the Indiana State Fair Board, decided to make it permanent. In the intervening years, upwards of 3 million people have visited the attraction, and the museum claims it's the most visited pharmacy museum in America.
You get the whole show now if you hurry, hurry, hurry.
While you can't see the Beatles at this year's Indiana State Fair, you can see the latest agricultural innovations, taste Jessop's original butterscotch popcorn, and take a walk through Hook's Drugstore Museum. I hope you enjoyed our tour through the 165-year history of the Indiana State Fair. I'm Lindsay Beckley, and this has been Talking Hoosier History. As always, a big thank you goes to sound engineer Joe Weiss and to Justin Clark, the voice of newspapers here on the podcast. Find us on Facebook at Talking Hoosier History and on Twitter at @TalkHoosierHist. That's HIST. And finally, please subscribe, rate, and review Talking Hoosier History wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.